Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
I knew exactly how that dinner would go because it always went the same way, with my mother opening the night like a master of ceremonies who never learned the difference between celebration and competition. So when she lifted her glass and announced that my brother had been promoted again, and then tilted her head at me with that practiced little smile that always meant a punchline was coming and asked, in front of everyone, when I would finally make something of myself, I did the one thing I have never done at that table, which was to stop performing for them, take one calm sip of wine, and say, as evenly as I could, that I already had, and that I did not owe her the details. You know the way a room gets quiet when the script breaks, not because anything dramatic happened, but because something expected did not. And you can feel people trying to find the line they are supposed to say next while their faces are still set in the last expression they rehearsed. So my mother's smile stayed right where it was even after the message landed. And my brother tried to rescue the rhythm with a joke about how I must mean I learned to make boxed macaroni without burning it, which used to be a reliable crowd pleaser when we were younger, except I was not 13 anymore, and I was not going to feed him the laugh by pretending it stung. And I just looked at him the way you look at a coworker who is reusing an old slide that has already been disproved, and I said nothing. There is a long history here, and I do not need to dress it up, because the facts are simple and anyone who grew up in a family like mine will recognize the beats. Where the eldest son is cast as the benchmark and every family update is a scoreboard that never closes, and where my choices were either to keep auditioning for a role I did not want or to step out of the show and accept the punishment, which was that anything I did would be called luck, or reckless, or a phase, or a cry for attention, and anything he did would be called leadership, or potential, or proof that the parenting worked, so I opted out, moved my life into a space they did not monitor, and learned to let the noise roll past me like bad stock tips from people who do not invest. I came to that dinner because my aunt asked me, and because she said my grandmother was hoping to see me, and I told myself I could sit through 2 hours of small talk without biting, but when the question came at full volume, pitched like a punchline with everyone watching for my reaction, something in me decided we were done playing the quiet game, and the message I sent was not for my mother, or my brother, or the cousins craning their necks. It was for myself. A reminder that I do not need to justify a life that is working to people who prefer a story where I am always almost doing okay. My mother tried to wrap the moment in that tone she uses when she wants to frame cruelty as concern, telling me not to be sensitive, and that we only want the best for you, and that it hurts us to see you wasting your potential, and I said that I understood, and that I would keep that in mind, and then I asked my aunt about her physical therapy because her knee has been giving her trouble, and she hates feeling dependent, and the relief on her face told me I had done the right thing by pivoting. Because the conversation finally moved away from the stage and into something human, and for a few minutes it almost felt like a normal family meal where people listen instead of tally. Of course my brother could not leave it alone, because he is addicted to the applause and cannot tolerate any silence that is not filled with his resume, so he steered it back by bragging about a major contract his company was about to land, talking fast and loud like he always does when he wants people to notice he is important, and he mentioned the client by name because he loves the sound of recognition in the room, which would have been harmless if that name did not belong to one of the clients who has trusted me for years, a client who asked me last quarter to review their vendor list and help them avoid getting dazzled by polished decks that hide mediocre execution, and I listened without reacting, while filing away every casual detail he dropped because he believed I was still the kid sister who takes notes only to study how to please them. I did not need to sabotage anything, and I did not intend to, because I am not here to break my brother's career. I am here to break the habit they have of telling my story for me. So when dessert hit the table and everyone leaned on their chairs like they had won something, and my mother asked again, sweet as icing, if I wanted to share any updates, I said I was good, thanked my aunt for the invitation, hugged my grandmother, and left before the after-dinner performance could start, and the wildest part was how quiet the car felt, not just because I closed the door on the noise, but because I finally felt done asking for permission to be proud of work I had already done. In the driveway, with the engine off and my coat still unbuttoned, I pulled up a contact labeled with a first name only and a star because that is how I keep my phone from looking like a spreadsheet. And I typed a short message that said I would appreciate 10 minutes tomorrow morning regarding a vendor you mentioned last month, and that I had context she might want before her board met after the holidays, and I hit send. Not as an act of vengeance, but as a simple correction to a story that has been told wrong for too long, because if my brother wanted to swagger through a room using my client's name as proof that he is winning, then it was fair to make sure the client knew exactly who had been helping them ask better questions in the first place. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed with a reply that read like a door swinging open, asking if 7:30 worked and whether I preferred a quick call or a brief video chat, and I sat on the edge of the bed and let out a laugh that was not mean. Just relieved, because it is amazing how light you feel when you stop carrying everyone else's version of you, and I wrote back that a quick call would be perfect and that I would send a calendar invite, and then I stared at the ceiling and realized that the thing I had been avoiding for years was not confrontation or fallout. It was the moment where I stopped being the quiet one for their comfort and became the person I actually am, which is someone who does not waste words and does not owe anyone proof. I am not going to tell you exactly what I plan to say on that call, not yet, because the whole point is timing and I have finally learned how to use it, but I will tell you this much, which is enough to keep you with me until tomorrow morning, when I hang up. My mother will wish she had never asked for details, and my brother will finally understand that silence does not mean weakness. It means I have been holding the last move and waiting for the right board to play it on. The call the next morning was short on pleasantries and long on substance, which is exactly how I like conversations that actually matter. So after we said our quick hellos and she thanked me for always being the person who gives her the version no one puts in the slide deck, I told her, in plain terms and without any drama, that the vendor my brother could not stop bragging about at dinner was very good at polishing language, very good at playing to ego, and very good at making the decision makers feel like visionaries. Yet when we ran their pilots earlier this year, the delivery team kept changing, the post-launch support windows quietly shrank, and the cost of change orders multiplied in ways that look harmless on paper but eat margins in real life. And I reminded her of the late-night phone call she made to me in the spring when a different partner left her team stranded, and how she said never again. Which is why I was calling now, not to tank anyone's deal but to make sure she had all the information before her board sat down after the holidays and wondered why they were being asked to bless something that would look impressive for one quarter and painful for the rest of the year. She did not argue, because we have been through enough messes together that she knows I am not the kind of person who enjoys knocking down other people's work for sport. And she asked for specifics she could take into the next meeting without burning my name into the table, so I gave her 3 clean points she could verify independently, each one tied to outcomes that matter to a board rather than to people who like to clap at presentations. And when we hung up, she said something I have always wished my mother would say, which was that she appreciated my restraint, because waiting to speak until you have something real to add is not weakness, it is discipline, and it saves everyone time. I did not need to do anything else that morning, but old habits die hard, so I opened my laptop and drafted a 1-page note summarizing the checks her team could run quickly, with questions to ask in a way that sounds neutral but forces real answers. And I sent it to her with a line that said use it however you need, no attribution required, and then I made coffee and tried to will myself not to check my phone every other minute, which is funny given how loudly my family insists that I am impulsive and reactive, when the truth is I am the most patient person in the room until I am not, and when I choose to act it usually looks quiet from the outside even though it is a full-bodied decision on the inside. If you are wondering why I did not just call my brother and tell him to stop throwing around client names like party favors, it is because experience has taught me that direct talks with him turn into theater. And he will twist earnest advice into a jealousy story. He feeds our mother, and by dinner I will be recast as the bitter sister trying to hold him back. So I have learned to take the path that leaves less room for performance and more room for facts, which in this case means letting professionals evaluate professional claims without me in the spotlight, and if the result makes him uncomfortable, then maybe he will learn to keep certain names out of his mouth when he is peacocking at family tables. By afternoon I had 3 emails, all short and careful, from 3 different people at the client company. Each one a polite version of "we ran the checks and discovered some gaps we had not seen, and thank you for flagging that without making us feel stupid." And one of them added that the person pitching from my brother's company had been very confident, but also oddly quick to deflect exact questions about who would own the messy parts after signing, which is exactly the kind of deflection I watch for when I am paid to protect teams from charming mistakes, and I sat back and let the quiet satisfaction roll through me. Not because I wanted to win against my brother, but because I wanted the decision makers to win against the same tricks that once made me feel small in my own house. That night my phone lit up with a message from him that started friendly and turned sharp halfway through. Something like, "Heard you are consulting for people we know. Would have been nice to get an introduction." And then a line that said, "Hope you are not making things harder for me out of spite," which is the kind of sentence a person writes when they believe their feelings are the center of the map. And I read it twice, closed the thread without replying, and left the phone face down on the counter, because the only person I owed a response to that day had already gotten it and had used it to protect her team, and the rest was just my brother cycling through moods because the applause did not come as fast as he expected. The next morning my aunt called to ask how dinner felt for me, because she has always been the one person in that house who sees me as a full person rather than as an accessory to my brother's myth, and I told her it was fine and that I was tired of the routine. And she sighed and said she wished my mother would let it go, and I said she will not, because the story gives her something to manage, and people who need control do not surrender the one lever they know how to pull. And my aunt asked if I was going to come by on Sunday because my grandmother wanted to send me home with leftovers, and I laughed and said of course, and then she said something careful, asking whether I had heard that my brother's company might be re-reviewing a big opportunity due to a conflict flag, which told me news had started to seep through the family channels even though I had said nothing to anyone. And I told her calmly that work is work and family is family, and sometimes it is best if those lines do not cross. You might think the satisfaction would be enough, that proving a point in private would scratch the itch, but there is a difference between winning a round and changing a pattern. And I have spent too many years swallowing digs to pretend that one clean professional correction would fix a habit that has been rehearsed since we were kids. So when I got an invite later that week to a small industry breakfast hosted by the very client who ran my checks, and I saw the guest list included my brother's boss and 2 people from procurement who care a lot more about delivery than about flair, I said yes without hesitation, and I made a quiet promise to myself that if the opportunity presented itself, I would introduce myself not as anyone's sister, but as the person who keeps messy projects from becoming expensive apologies, and I would let their reactions do the rest. What I did not expect, and what made me set the phone down and take a long breath I did not know I had been holding, was the follow-up note from the host asking whether I would be comfortable doing a brief off-the-record chat about vendor accountability, because she had a few guests who needed to hear it from someone who was not trying to sell them anything. And in that moment I understood that the plan I never said out loud was unfolding anyway, because when you stop auditioning for your family and start speaking where it counts, rooms open, names move differently, and the story that has been used to box you in begins to fall apart on its own, and all you have to do is show up, sit down, and answer questions like a grown woman who no longer needs permission to be taken seriously. So yes, I said I would do it, and yes, I kept my tone calm and my notes even shorter than usual, but in the back of my mind I could already see the table at that breakfast. And I could hear the exact moment when someone would connect my name to a decision that had just shifted under their feet, and if you are wondering whether I plan to twist the knife, the answer is no, because I do not need to. Since the sharpest cut is the one where you do nothing flashy and yet everyone at the table realizes they have been clapping for the wrong performance, and the only thing left for me to decide is whether I will stay for coffee afterward when my brother's boss asks how long I have been doing this, and why no one has heard my name in the family stories. The breakfast was one of those small gatherings that pretend to be casual while everyone there is quietly measuring who actually moves decisions and who just repeats them, so I walked in without fanfare, took a seat that was not at the center and not at the edge. And when the host introduced me as someone who keeps projects from turning into apology tours, I kept my voice steady and practical, and I talked about the kinds of gaps that show up when vendors sell certainty they cannot deliver, And I used simple examples that any operations person could test before lunch, and I made sure every suggestion could be traced to results rather than to style, because the goal was never to perform. It was to make sure the people who signed checks felt confident pushing back on sugar-coated promises that collapse as soon as the ink dries. Halfway through, the procurement lead asked how to tell the difference between a motivated sales team and a desperate one, and I said that motivated teams welcome detail while desperate teams call detail a distraction. And I watched two people glance at each other in the way that says a light has just gone on, and I did not lean into it. I did not press. I just offered one clean checklist for pressure testing accountability, then took a sip of water and let the silence do its job, and when the host thanked me, no one clapped because this was not that kind of room. They just nodded with the relief that comes when someone finally names the thing everyone has been tiptoeing around. Afterward, as people milled in that polite circle of business cards and half-promises, the client who invited me brought over a tall man with an efficient smile and introduced him as the executive who oversees the line of business my brother keeps bragging about, and the moment our hands met I saw the recognition flicker. The quick mental math of sister and consultant and recent diligence, and he said he appreciated the clarity of my remarks and that vendor accountability was earning a lot more attention that quarter, and I said I was glad to hear it, and that my only agenda was helping good teams avoid bad surprises, and he said something careful about revisiting assumptions before making irreversible moves. And then he asked where I had learned to be so comfortable pushing back on confident people, and I said family dinners will either train you well or break you, and he laughed a real laugh, not a networking laugh, and said point taken. I did not mention my brother, because I do not owe this world my family drama, and I did not need to, since the adults in the room already understood the signals, so I kept the conversation narrow and useful, and when he excused himself to take a call, the procurement lead lingered and asked whether I would be willing to do a private workshop for her team on framing questions that force real ownership, and I said yes, as long as the questions were used to tease out truth rather than to trap people, and she said that was exactly the point, that they were tired of carrying the fallout from showmanship, and I thought to myself that if my brother ever learned to love substance as much as he loves applause, he would be unstoppable. But I knew he would never put down the microphone long enough to try. By lunch, word had traveled fast enough that my phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking whether everything was all right with Ethan's promotion and whether I had heard anything, which meant the executive had already walked back into his office and asked for a pause on the celebratory emails while someone reran the checks we discussed, and I stared at her message and felt that familiar bitter taste she always manages to place in my mouth by turning every event into a referendum on her favorite child, and I typed back that I had no idea about his promotion and that she should probably ask him, and I left it at that, because she is not entitled to backstage passes to my work just because she would like to steer my choices back into her narrative. If all of this sounds like I pushed a button designed to set off a specific alarm, understand that the truth is simpler and cleaner, which is that I put the right information in front of the right people and let their responsibilities do the rest. And if that information made my brother's pitch wobble, then maybe the pitch was not built to stand without smoke and mirrors, and if my mother decided to see my boundaries as an attack, then that is a feeling she can keep, because I am no longer collecting her emotions and paying interest on them. That afternoon, I sent a short note to the host thanking her for the invite and offering the deck I use for teams trying to fix this problem before it starts. And she replied that she would love the deck and that one of the guests had already asked for an introduction to me because they were tired of losing credibility every time a promised launch date slid with another excuse. And I felt a warm kind of vindication that did not need to be paraded, and I thought about how many years I had wasted trying to win points in a home that only ever kept score on one side, and how strangely uncomplicated life becomes when you move your scoreboard to a place where results are measured by outcomes rather than by dinner table applause. Then, just when I was about to close my laptop and let the day end quietly, my brother called, not texted, which he only does when he wants to control tone, and he led with small talk that sounded like he had practiced it in front of a mirror. And he said he had heard I was at a breakfast with his boss and a few people from procurement, and that it would have been nice if I had given him a heads up, and then he asked if I had shared anything that might have complicated timing because there were some last-minute questions out of nowhere, and the way he said out of nowhere told me he was not used to anyone checking his swagger, and I told him, calmly, that I attend a lot of breakfasts and that I talk about accountability wherever I am asked, and that if his timeline was wobbling, he might want to look at the structure rather than at me, and he went quiet in that way that means he is choosing between bluster and charm, and for once he picked neither and just said okay. I could have ended it there and let the natural friction do the teaching, but I have learned that revenge is not about fire, it is about precision, so I added that if he plans to keep pitching to clients who trust me, he should probably stop using their names like party decorations at family events, because people who respect me do not enjoy hearing their business treated like an ego prop, and he exhaled hard and said I was making it personal, and I said no. I was making it professional and that I would be happy to introduce him to the part of my work where adults speak plainly, but if he preferred the old show, he should leave me out of it, and after a long pause he said he needed to run and hung up without the usual sign-off. That night, just before I turned off the lights, an email landed from the executive with the efficient smile asking for a short call first thing in the morning to discuss a vendor governance framework and whether I would consider a formal advisory role for a quarter while they clean up some habits. And attached to the invite was a draft agenda that included a line item I had not expected to see so soon, which was reconsideration of celebratory announcements pending due diligence, and while I did not write back right away, I knew the decision was already made in my head, because if there was ever a quiet, surgical way to correct a decade of being underestimated, it was this. And the only open question now was how my mother would handle the silence when the congratulatory cake stayed in the freezer for one more week. The call with the executive the next morning was brief, polite, and very precise. And after we walked through the agenda line by line, he asked if I was willing to step in for a single quarter as an independent advisor on vendor governance, while they rebuilt some muscles they had let atrophy. And I told him yes on the condition that I would have the freedom to design a simple, testable framework that did not turn into theater, that I would report to him directly so there would be no confusion about authority, and that any recommendations would be applied evenly regardless of who was charming, well-connected, or good at making rooms laugh. And he said those terms were acceptable and that legal would send over a short agreement by end of day. And I said good, because if we were going to do this, we were going to do it clean. I started by drawing 3 lines that every team could understand without a thick manual, which mattered because people do not follow what they cannot remember. So the first was verification over vibes, meaning no one would be approved on presentation alone. Every claim would be matched to a deliverable, and every deliverable would be traceable to someone who could be reached after the celebration ended. The second was ownership on paper, meaning someone from the vendor had to sign their actual name next to each risk with a plan that looked like it could survive a bad quarter. And the third was consequence, meaning any material inconsistency uncovered after signing would trigger a financial correction and a pause on renewals. Not a long apology tour with flowers, and once those lines were in place, I built a short set of questions that sound friendly but force truth, because I have learned that the fastest way to break a habit of bluffing is to make the bluff expensive. When we ran the first pilot of the framework, I kept the meeting as boring as possible on purpose, because you learn a lot about a company when applause is not part of the agenda. And it took only 15 minutes to see which vendors were there to be real partners and which ones were hoping personality would cover gaps. And yes, my brother's firm walked in with the shiniest materials and the most confident pitch, and yes, the documents looked tight until you matched them against the question of who owns the mess when a timeline slips, at which point the answers started to stretch, and when we asked for specific post-launch escalation contacts instead of a general support alias, the names grew vague. And when we asked who would be accountable if the promised integration point stalled, the voice in the room grew friendly and non-committal in the exact way that used to manipulate me at home, which is why I kept my face neutral and my notes specific and let the questions do the work. I am aware that some people would call this revenge disguised as governance, and if that helps them sleep, fine. But the truth is simpler and, to me, cleaner, because I did not go looking for him. He brought his swagger into a lane where my name already worked. And I decided to protect the people who trust me by telling them what I have learned the hard way, which is that charm evaporates the moment responsibility shows up, and I would not have to say a single word about my brother's character. For his company's structure to reveal itself under pressure, which it did without help from me beyond a calm insistence on answers that could survive daylight. While all of this was moving forward, my mother kept pinging my phone with those messages that sound like concern, but feel like supervision. Wanting to know whether I was free for dinner on Sunday because the family wanted to celebrate Ethan, and it would be nice if I could be gracious about it for once, and then a second message an hour later asking if I would talk to Ethan to help smooth things. Because there had been what she called silly misunderstandings at work, and it would be a shame if. Petty office politics cost him momentum, and reading those lines took me straight back to high school evenings where my job was to make the room easy for her favorite person. So I wrote back one sentence that I must have owed myself for years, which was that I am not available to manage Ethan's feelings or career, and that I would not be attending any celebration centered on my compliance, and I put the phone away without waiting for the inevitable reply accusing me of being ungrateful, because boundaries do not require debates, they require repetition. The executive, to his credit, shielded the process from noise, which let the work speak. And within a week the procurement lead had quietly slotted 3 vendors into a blind test with narrowly defined outcomes and a simple scoring rubric that even a board member could follow without caffeine. And each vendor was told to bring the names of the people who would actually do the work rather than the people who merely sold it, and each was asked to walk a live scenario with real data instead of a polished demo with imaginary timelines. And when my brother's team tried to steer the conversation back to the vision, the lead smiled politely and returned to the scenario questions with the kind of steady pressure that separates grown-ups from performers. And I did not have to lift a finger beyond nodding when someone gave a real answer and pausing when someone dodged, which is a small gesture that carries weight in rooms where people are used to being rescued from silence. Out of fairness to the process, I disclosed to the executive that one of the reps pitching was my brother, and he thanked me for the transparency and said the framework would keep us honest, and I said exactly. Which is why I built it to stand even when the names in the room are familiar, and he nodded and moved on because that is how adults operate when they care about outcomes, and I felt a kind of peace I have not had in a long time, knowing that this moment would not depend on my speeches, or my mother's narratives or my brother's theatrics, only on whether the team behind the slides could hold their weight when asked to put specifics on the table. At the end of the second workshop, just as we were gathering the handouts and people were checking their calendars, the executive asked if I would join the board's working session the following week to summarize the framework before they voted on next steps, which would include either a green light to proceed with a narrowed field or a full reset with new criteria. And as he spoke, I watched the color drain from my brother's manager's face in that quiet way you only notice if you have spent years studying expressions at family tables, because he realized that the person he had treated like a harmless accessory at a breakfast was now the one explaining to a board why certainty needs proof. And that realization was not my victory so much as it was the natural result of a system working the way it should have worked all along. The night before the board session, my mother called me from a blocked number, which is a move she uses when she wants to pretend she is someone else calling for help. And she asked if we could meet for coffee because she was worried that I was letting resentment ruin the holidays, and I told her that I would not be meeting, that I had work to finish and no interest in rehashing the past. And she said I was being dramatic and that family is all that matters, and I said family matters when it behaves like family and not like a ratings committee, and then I ended the call before she could turn my words into another weapon. And I sat with the silence for a minute and felt the steadiness that comes from sticking to a line you drew for yourself and not stepping over it just to make someone else comfortable. When the board session began the next afternoon, the conference room was calm in that purposeful way that tells you decisions will actually be made, not postponed, and as I walked through the 3 lines and the handful of questions that had revealed the gaps, I kept my tone level and my examples lean, and I watched the heads nod in that slow, careful rhythm that means a story is being rewritten in real time, and when the chair asked me whether the scoring suggested any immediate action before year-end, I said the rubric speaks for itself and that, if it were my money, I would pause one vendor, accelerate a second for a limited pilot, and thank a third for their time, and I stopped there. Because it is powerful to let a room sit with a clean recommendation that does not beg for applause, and as the chair looked down at the packet with the names beside the scores, I felt my phone buzz inside my bag with a message from my brother that I did not open, and I kept my eyes forward while the chair cleared his throat and said they would move to a vote, which is where I will leave you for a minute, because the best part of this story is not just what they decided. It is who was sitting at the table when the decision finally landed and who had to watch me name the terms without raising my voice. They voted to pause, not because I argued them into it or because I made a scene, but because the framework made the decision obvious in a way that did not require anyone to defend their pride. And when the chair announced that they would freeze the announcement, accelerate a limited pilot with the vendor that had answered the hard questions plainly, and thank the third for their time, the air in the room shifted in that quiet way that means the story has already been rewritten even before the emails go out, and I sat there with my hands folded and my notes closed and let the result be what it was, which is that my work stood without me pushing it. And that is a feeling I wish I could bottle and hand to every younger version of me who tried to earn respect by performing at the dinner table. The meeting ended without drama and I walked out without looking at my phone because I wanted the decision to settle before the noise found me. But by the time I reached the elevator, my brother's messages had stacked into a little column of missed calls and half-typed paragraphs, and I could hear the rhythm even without opening them. First the accusation that I had ruined something, then the plea for help framed as a chance for me to prove I was not a jealous person, then the guilt hook about family loyalty, and I let the screen go dark and kept moving because I have finally learned that there is no sentence I can send to a person who built his identity on applause that will teach him how to handle silence. And that lesson is his to learn with his own ears ringing. Back at my desk, the executive called to thank me for staying disciplined and to confirm the advisory arrangement in writing, which was short, clean, and respectful. And he asked if I would be comfortable briefing the operations leads on how to use the questions without turning them into gotchas, and I said yes, because the whole point of doing this out loud was to build something that would keep standing when I left. And after we hung up, I allowed myself one very small indulgence, which was to open my inbox and reread the note my client sent after the diligence checks, the one where she said she appreciated that I never made her feel stupid for missing what a confident pitch was designed to hide. And if you think that line is the revenge, you have not been listening, because the real revenge is that people who were trained to dismiss me now have to carry my framework forward as the baseline for sanity, and that means I do not have to sit at any table where my worth is debated like a menu item. Later that afternoon, my mother left a voicemail that started with her careful, bright voice and collapsed halfway through into the sharper tone she keeps for me, telling me that Ethan was devastated and that this was not the week to be difficult, and that I should remember who drove me to practice and who paid for 100 little things I did not thank her for, and I listened to the whole thing once, end to end, because I do not want to lie to myself about what it is, and then I deleted it, not as a statement, but as a habit I intend to keep, because I will not archive speeches that ask me to shrink so someone else can feel large. And a few minutes later I sent a message to my aunt telling her I would stop by to see my grandmother over the weekend and bring something she could freeze, and my aunt sent back a heart in words, not an emoji, because that is the kind of woman she is, kind in ways that do not require an audience. That weekend, when I walked into my grandmother's kitchen, she did not ask about promotions or titles or who was winning. She asked whether I was sleeping and whether my shoulders still hurt when I sit too long. And then she said she saw my name in an industry write-up that one of her friends' adult children posted, and that she felt proud but also relieved because she had always suspected I kept my life quiet to stay safe. And I told her that was exactly right and that I was finally done hiding. Not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one, and she nodded and said good. Then she slipped me a folded card that she had written by hand with a sentence I will keep as long as I live, which said you do not owe anyone your proof. And I hugged her longer than I usually allow myself to, because sometimes the win is not the headline, but the way a person who matters mirrors you back to yourself without asking you to perform. The following day, because I believe in clean endings, I sent my brother one message that did not invite a fight, telling him that work is moving according to the client's criteria and that I am not available to translate that into family language. And that if he wants to win the next round, he should bring the people who will actually do the work and let them answer questions directly. And I added that if he stops using my clients' names to puff up family stories, our paths will cross less painfully. And then I muted the thread for a month, because you cannot change a dynamic if you keep feeding it attention every hour, and I refuse to let my phone be a slot machine that dispenses guilt. I know what you might be thinking, that the grand finale should be a speech at the same dinner table where this started, something showy where I unveil a title and a number and watch the room choke on it, but that would make me a performer in the play I already quit. So instead I did something smaller and sharper that will last longer, which is that I set up a scholarship at the community college near where we grew up, in my grandmother's name, for adults who go back to school after leaving a job that looked stable but ate their soul, and I paid the first year in full and asked the school to notify donors privately and recipients publicly, and when my mother eventually sees the announcement through one of her friends, she will finally learn the only detail that matters about what I chose to make of myself, which is that I built something that moves without her permission and helps people who will never have to sit through our family's kind of scoreboard dinner to earn a seat in their own lives. On the night I knew the internal memo about the paused announcement had gone out, I received one last message from my mother in the family group thread. A cheerful line about rescheduling the celebration for later in the season and a pointed aside that everyone should be supportive of Ethan during this tough patch, and I typed back a single sentence that was neither cruel nor apologetic, saying I hope he finds a team that matches what he promises and that I am not available for further discussion, and then I put the phone down and opened my laptop to finalize the simple handbook the operations leads had asked me to leave behind. A few pages of questions and red flags and plain language translations of the tricks that cost people real money. And as I finished the last paragraph, I felt the click that told me the plan I would never have dared to say out loud at that Christmas table was complete, which is that I did not just win a round. I changed the rules in a way that made the old game feel childish. So when people ask how it ended, I tell them the truth that sounds smaller than it felt, which is that I took a sip of wine, said I did not owe details, kept my promise to myself, and played the last move I was saving. The one where I stop being the family supporting character and become the person whose name quietly ends up on agendas, on frameworks, on the scholarship line that makes a stranger's life a little easier, and if there is any unfinished business left, it belongs to the people who still believe that worth is a speech you perform at dinner, not a life you build without applause, and I can live with that, because the silence I earn tastes better than any toast they were ever going to raise in my honor. And the best part is knowing that the next time someone asks me when I will finally make something of myself, I will smile, not as armor, but as recognition, because the answer has been the same all along, which is that I already did. And I still do not owe you the details.